In the spaces between stars, time moves differently. Not in the way physicists might describe, though they would certainly have theories. No, it is something far more primal than that. It is the way silence accumulates across centuries, the way darkness itself seems to age, the way hope can erode grain by grain until what remains is no longer hope at all, but merely the memory of having once possessed it. High Arbiter Veth Soral of the Sir Karath Ascendancy understood this intimately now.
He stood at the observation deck of the Eternal Vigil, the last of the great cathedral ships that had once numbered in the thousands, and he watched the distant stars burn with the same cold indifference they had burned when his species first touched the void 17,000 years ago. They did not care that his civilization was dying. They did not mourn the worlds that had gone dark.
They simply continued their ancient fusion dance, patient and eternal, while everything his people had built crumbled into ash. Veth Soral was old, even by the standards of a species that measured lifespans in centuries. His segmented carapace had dulled from the deep crimson of youth to a weathered bronze that spoke of too many decisions, too many losses, too many quiet moments standing exactly where he stood now, watching the void consume everything he loved. Behind him, the deck was silent save for the soft hum of ancient systems. Once, this observation chamber would have been filled with scholars and diplomats, artists and warriors, all of them engaged in the endless discourse that had defined Sir Karath culture since before humanity's ancestors had climbed down from trees. Now there was only emptiness.
And the numbers.
Always the numbers. 14 billion dead at the burning of Kethvaral. 7 colony worlds gone dark in the outer reaches. The 3rd and 5th combined fleets, nearly 18,000 vessels, reduced to cooling debris in the span of a single rotation. The consuming had returned. After 9,000 years of silence, after centuries of believing the threat had been vanquished by the great coalition of old, the darkness between galaxies had stirred once more, and this time there was no coalition. Only fragments, only survivors, only the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, someone had the strength to stand against the tide. Veth Soral closed his 4 eyes slowly, feeling the weight of every year he had lived pressing down upon his thoracic plates. "Arbiter." The voice came from behind him, soft and respectful. Sub-Commander Tyel Nis, young enough to still believe in solutions, old enough to hide her fear behind duty. She had been one of his brightest students at the Collegium, before the Collegium had become a grave. "The human delegation has arrived at Sanctuary Station," she said. "The Council of Remnants is gathering." Veth Soral did not turn. How many ships did they bring? A pause. He could feel her hesitation, sense the discomfort radiating from her in subtle chemical signals. 47. Arbiter. 47. He repeated the number as though tasting something unfamiliar. And the Velthrani? The Christen Collective? The Velthrani have committed their remaining 1,200 vessels. The Christen Collective brings 340, plus their orbital foundries. And the humans sent 47 ships. He finally turned, studying his aide's expression with the practiced eye of someone who had negotiated with 100 species across a dozen millennia. Tyel Nis was trying very hard to maintain her composure, but he could read the truth in the tension of her mandibles, the way her secondary arms crossed protectively over her thorax. Disappointment, perhaps even disgust.
"You believe they mock us?" he said.
"I believe," she replied carefully, "that we may have placed too much faith in a species we have never truly understood. The humans are young, Arbiter, barely 3 centuries in the void. Perhaps they simply cannot comprehend the scale of what we face." Veth Sorel considered this. He considered the 17,000 years of Ser-Korath history, the countless species they had guided toward enlightenment, the wars they had fought and won, the crises they had weathered. He considered the arrogance that had always lurked beneath their wisdom, the unspoken certainty that as the eldest of the starfaring peoples, they were also the most essential. And he considered the humans. He had met them only twice before. Once, nearly 2 centuries ago, when their first ambassador had come to the Ascendancy seeking trade agreements. He remembered being mildly curious about the soft-skinned bipeds, their peculiar single-paired eyes, their oddly limited sensory capabilities. They had seemed fragile, temporary, the kind of species that might persist for a few thousand years before fading into the margins of galactic history, as so many had before them. The second time had been 40 years ago, when human merchants had begun appearing at the edge of Ser-Korath space with growing frequency. They had been polite, efficient, utterly unremarkable in their ambitions. They wanted to trade. They wanted to learn. They wanted, above all else, to be left in peace to develop their modest territories. And the Ser-Korath, in their infinite wisdom, had dismissed them as a minor species of no particular consequence. Now the Ascendancy was dying, and 47 human ships had come to answer their call for aid. "Perhaps you are right," Veth Sorel said softly. "Perhaps they simply do not understand." But something in the way he spoke made Tyal-Nis pause. "You sound uncertain, Arbiter." "I am old enough to be uncertain about many things." He moved toward the chamber's exit, his robes trailing behind him in the artificial gravity. "Come, let us see what the humans have to say for themselves." Sanctuary Station was the last great gathering place of the elder species. Built into the hollowed core of a rogue moon, it had drifted through the void between galactic arms for 6 million years, serving as neutral ground for civilizations that had long since turned to dust. The Ser-Korath had inherited its stewardship from the architects, who had inherited it from the Preluminates, who had constructed it in an age so distant that even light from those times had not yet reached the younger galaxies. Now it was full of refugees. The docking bays that had once received diplomatic delegations in carefully orchestrated ceremonies were crammed with civilian transports, damaged warships, and the pitiful remnants of a dozen once proud fleets. The air recyclers struggled to accommodate the millions who had fled here, and the atmosphere carried the distinctive chemical signatures of fear from species that had never learned to hide such things. Veth Sorel walked through the corridors of the central diplomatic spire with Tyal-Nis at his side, passing clusters of refugees who pressed themselves against walls to let him pass. They recognized his rank insignia. They looked at him with desperate hope, as though the mere presence of a high arbiter might somehow restore order to a galaxy spinning toward oblivion. He had no comfort to offer them. The Council of Remnants had convened in what had once been the Grand Arbitration Chamber. The circular space was vast, its domed ceiling displaying a real-time projection of the station's surroundings, mostly empty void, though sensors tracked the movements of the consuming's advance forces at the edge of detection range. As Veth Sorel entered, he counted the representatives present. High Admiral Cress Valor of the Velthrani stood near the center, her iridescent scales catching the light as she conferred with her tactical officers.
The Velthrani had been the Ascendancy's closest allies for 4,000 years, proud warriors who traced their lineage to predatory pack hunters on a world of endless storms. They had brought 1,200 ships. 1,200 ships, where once they might have summoned 50,000. The Kristhan Collective's delegation occupied a raised platform to the left, their crystalline bodies humming with the subtle frequencies of their networked consciousness. They were ancient in their own way, though they experienced time differently than organic species. Their 340 vessels were impressive only because the collective built each ship slowly over centuries, imbuing them with a fragment of collective awareness. Every lost vessel was a wound to their shared mind. Scattered around the chamber were representatives of smaller powers, the Threni Syndicate with their 80 remaining warships, the Urel Enclave with perhaps 60, a handful of independent traders and mercenary fleets who had come because there was nowhere else to go.
And near the far wall, standing quietly apart from the others, were the humans. Vethosorel studied them as he approached. There were 3 of them, wearing simple dark uniforms without the elaborate ornamentation that most species favored for diplomatic occasions. 2 females and 1 male, he thought, though human sexual dimorphism had always been difficult for him to parse. They stood with an unusual stillness, watching the proceedings with expressions that revealed nothing. The lead human was a woman. Yes, definitely female, he could see it now, with close-cropped gray hair and skin weathered by what he assumed was age. She held no visible weapons, carried no obvious indicators of rank beyond a small cluster of medals on her chest. When her eyes met his, he felt an odd sensation, as though something behind those pale irises was measuring him in ways he did not understand.
High Admiral Cress Valor spotted him and crossed the chamber in 3 swift strides. Arbiter Veth Sorol, I am relieved to see you survived the fall of the Second Fleet.
I was not present when it fell, he replied. I was negotiating with the outer colonies, trying to convince them to join the defense.
And?
They are gone now. The consuming reached them before I could return with their answer.
Cressvolar's scales shifted to a darker hue, the Velthrani expression of grief.
Then we are truly alone.
Perhaps not entirely. Vetsorel gestured toward the human delegation. They came. The Admiral's expression shifted again, this time to something closer to contempt. Yes, 47 ships. I have reviewed their specifications. They are not even true warships by Velthrani standards. Small, unimpressive, armed adequately for pirate suppression perhaps, but against the consuming? She made a clicking sound that needed no translation. They waste our time with this insult.
Have you spoken with them? Why would I? Their contribution is meaningless. We should focus our efforts on the forces that can actually make a difference.
Vetsorel was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, he began walking toward the human delegation.
Where are you going? Cressvolar demanded.
To understand, he replied, why they came at all.
The lead human watched him approach without moving.
Up close, she seemed even more unremarkable than she had from a distance. Her uniform was spotless but plain, lacking even the basic holographic elements that most spacefaring species incorporated into their formal attire. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, relaxed in a way that seemed almost aggressive in its lack of ceremony.
High Arbiter Veth Sorol, she said, and the translator implant rendered her voice in his native tongue with unusual precision. I am Admiral Chen Wei Lin, commanding officer of the Seoul Defense Initiative's Expeditionary Force. These are Captain Marcus Webb and Commander Yuki Tanaka.
The other 2 humans nodded in acknowledgement. Neither spoke.
Admiral Chen,
Veth-Sorrel inclined his head in the traditional Serkarath greeting. I am grateful that humanity has answered our call, though I confess I am curious about the scope of your response. 47 ships, Chen said. I imagine that seems inadequate. The observation has been made. By the Velthroni Admiral, yes. She made her feelings clear during our initial communications. Chen's expression did not change. She's wrong, but I understand why she thinks that way. Veth-Sorrel studied the human carefully. There was no defensiveness in her posture, no wounded pride in her voice. She spoke as though stating a simple fact about the weather. You understand why she believes your contribution is insufficient, yet you maintain she is mistaken? I understand that she's measuring our value by the number of ships we've brought. That's a reasonable metric when you're fighting the kind of wars the elder species have always fought. Chen paused. But the consuming isn't that kind of enemy, is it? Veth-Sorrel felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in decades. Interest, perhaps even hope, though he crushed that feeling quickly. Hope was a liability now. What do you know of the consuming? What your archives tell us. What the warning signals from the outer reaches told us, what we've observed ourselves over the past 18 months. They reached the outer edges of human-monitored space several months before that. We've been watching them. Watching. The word felt strange in his mouth. You have been watching an extinction-level threat approach the galaxy, and you chose merely to observe? For the first time, something flickered in Chen's expression. Not anger exactly, something more complex. We've been preparing, High Arbiter. There's a difference. Before Veth-Sorrel could respond, a commotion erupted near the center of the chamber. High Admiral Cressvoler's voice rose above the ambient noise, sharp with command. The consuming has breached the outer defense perimeter. Multiple incursion vectors. All fleet commanders to your vessels immediately. The chamber dissolved into controlled chaos. Representatives scattered toward exits. Tactical displays flickered to life around the room, and the calm atmosphere of diplomacy gave way to the urgent reality of war. Veth-Sorrel turned back to Chen, expecting to see the same fear that gripped everyone else in the room. The human admiral was simply watching, calm, attentive, as though the announcement had confirmed something she already knew. Your fleet, Veth-Sorrel said. What are your orders? My ships are already moving to their assigned positions. Assigned by whom? Chen smiled, and for the first time, Veth-Sorrel felt something cold trace down his spine. Admiral, you're welcome to observe from the command center. I think you'll find the next few hours educational. The first wave of the consuming arrived 17 minutes later. Veth-Sorrel watched from Sanctuary Station's primary command center. Surrounded by tactical officers from a dozen species, all of them struggling to process the data flooding their displays. The consuming did not attack like any enemy they had faced before. They did not form fleets in the traditional sense. They emerged from fold space in sprawling patterns that defied tactical analysis. Thousands of vessels, ranging from fighter-sized organisms to dreadnought-scale monstrosities, all moving in perfect coordination with no discernible command structure. They were hungry, these things. Hungry for matter, for energy, for the very substance of existence. When they consumed a world, they left nothing behind, not even debris. The combined fleet of the remnants moved to intercept. 1,200 Velthrani warships surged forward in the aggressive wedge formation their species had perfected over millennia of warfare. Their weapons fired with devastating precision, plasma lances cutting through the leading edge of the consuming swarm. For a moment, it seemed as though sheer firepower might be enough.
Then the consuming adapted. Veth Soral watched in horror as the swarm's outer elements began to shift, their forms changing in real time to deflect and absorb the Velthrani weapons. Vessels that had been destroyed moments before seemed to regenerate, drawing matter from the debris field to rebuild themselves. And still more emerged from fold space, an endless tide that made the Velthrani fleet look like a child's toy floating in an ocean.
"They're surrounding the 4th Squadron," one of the tactical officers reported, her voice tight with fear. "Hull breaches on multiple ships. They're boarding."
"Reinforce with the 5th and 6th, Cressvoller commanded from her position near the main display. "Full kinetic saturation. We need to buy time for—"
"Admiral," another officer interrupted. "The Chrysothan Collective is requesting immediate withdrawal authorization. They've lost 19% of their fleet in the first engagement."
"Denied. If we fragment now, we all die. Hold the line." But the line was already breaking. Veth Soral watched the tactical display with the hollow feeling of someone witnessing a tragedy they had always known was coming. The Velthrani were dying. The Chrysothan were dying. The smaller fleets were being picked apart at the edges, their ships consumed before they could even report their final positions. And through it all, he noticed something strange. The 47 human ships had not moved. They hung in formation at the rear of the combined fleet, their running lights steady, their weapons cold. They made no attempt to engage the enemy, no effort to support their allies. They simply waited.
"What are they doing?" Tyel Nis whispered beside him. "Why aren't they fighting?"
Veth Soral had no answer. Then, through the chaos of battle communications, a single message cut through the noise. Clear, calm, utterly out of place amid the screaming and dying. "Remnant Command, this is Admiral Chen. Be advised, we are beginning Phase 1. All Allied vessels are requested to withdraw to minimum safe distance immediately."
Cressvoller's response was immediate. "Withdraw? We are in the middle of a fight for survival, human. If your 47 ships wish to engage, then engage. But do not tell us to run while your tiny fleet watches."
A pause. Then Chen's voice again, patient as a teacher with a struggling student. "Admiral Cressvoller, I understand your frustration, but if your ships remain at current positions when Phase 1 activates, they will be destroyed along with the enemy. This is not a request. You have 4 minutes." "This is insanity. Veth Soral, tell this human." But Veth Soral was watching the tactical display. The human ships had begun to move. Not forward into the battle, but outward, spreading into a pattern he did not recognize. Their formation made no tactical sense by any doctrine he understood. They were positioning themselves in a vast sphere, each ship separated from the others by precisely equal distances. And as they moved, their power signatures began to climb. "Tyel Nis," he said softly. "What are you reading from those vessels?" His aide's hands moved across her console, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. That cannot be correct. Their power output is registering higher than our entire combined fleet."
"Per ship, Arbiter. Each of those 47 vessels is generating more energy than a Velthrani Dreadnought-class carrier." She looked up at him with wide eyes. "How is that possible? Their ships are a fraction of the size."
Veth Soral did not answer.
He was too busy watching Admiral Chen on the command display, standing calmly at the center of what appeared to be a small bridge crew, her hands clasped behind her back as though this were a routine training exercise.
All stations confirm readiness, Chen said. Quantum lock network is active and synchronized. Targeting solutions are complete. This is madness, Crest-Valor snapped. I will not sacrifice the fleet based on the theatrics of...
Admiral, Veth-Sorel interrupted, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. Order the withdrawal.
Crest-Valor turned to him, scales flashing with anger. You cannot be serious.
I have lived for over 300 years, Admiral. In that time, I have learned to recognize when someone is not bluffing. He gestured toward the display, toward Chen's impossibly calm face. Look at her. Does that seem like the expression of someone who does not know exactly what is about to happen?
For a long moment, Crest-Valor stared at him. Then she turned to her communications officer. All Velthrani vessels, emergency withdrawal. Repeat, emergency withdrawal to minimum safe distance, now. The order rippled through the fleet. Damaged ships that could barely move began limping backward. Intact vessels covered their retreat, still firing at the consuming swarm that pressed forward with mindless hunger.
30 seconds.
The human ships completed their formation.
20 seconds.
The power signatures spiked to levels that made Veth-Sorel's display briefly overload.
10 seconds.
Admiral Chen spoke, and her words were the last sound before everything changed. Phase 1. Execute. Later, when he tried to describe what happened next, Veth-Sorel would find that language failed him. It was not an explosion, not in the traditional sense. There was no release of kinetic energy, no expanding sphere of plasma or radiation. Instead, reality itself seemed to shudder. From each of the 47 human ships, something emerged. Not weapons fire, not projectiles, not beams of coherent energy. It was closer to a ripple, a distortion in the fabric of space-time that propagated outward at speeds that made light seem pedestrian. Where the ripples passed through empty space, they left nothing behind. Where they encountered the consuming, they left even less. Veth-Sorel watched as the endless swarm that had seemed so unstoppable simply ceased to exist, not destroyed, not vaporized, unmade. The ripples did not kill the consuming vessels, they erased them, as though they had never been present at all. The effect lasted less than 4 seconds. When it ended, the tactical display showed a sphere of absolute void where the enemy fleet had been. Millions of consuming organisms, gone. Dreadnought-scale horrors that had shrugged off Velthrani plasma lances, gone. The endless tide that had threatened to consume them all, gone. The only ships remaining within the sphere were the 47 human vessels, hanging silently in the void as though nothing had happened. The command center was absolutely silent. Teal-Nis spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. What did they just do? Veth-Sorel had no answer. On the display, Admiral Chen's image flickered back to life. Phase 1 complete. All enemy contacts within the engagement sphere have been neutralized. We are detecting additional hostile forces inbound from vectors 7 and 12. Estimated arrival 6 minutes. Crest-Valor found her voice, though it cracked with something Veth-Sorel had never heard from her before. What was that? That was a quantum dissolution field, Chen replied, as though explaining something ordinary. It selectively unbinds the molecular structure of targeted matter.
We apologize for not demonstrating it earlier, but we wanted to ensure we understood the enemy's adaptation capabilities before committing to full engagement.
You wanted to understand? Cressvalor trailed off, her scales cycling through colors Veth'Saral could not identify. You let our ships die while you gathered intelligence? Every Velthrani ship that was destroyed can be replaced, Chen said. Your crews are being recovered by our support vessels as we speak. 87% survival rate so far and climbing. A pause. We don't waste lives, Admiral. Any lives.
Veth'Saral stepped forward, drawing Chen's attention.
Admiral Chen, you said additional forces are inbound? Correct. The consuming operates in waves. This was just their scouting element. Their scouting element? Approximately 4 million vessels, yes. The main body is considerably larger.
The command center fell silent again. 4 million vessels had been the scouting element, the force that had nearly overwhelmed the entire combined fleet of the elder species was merely reconnaissance.
How much larger? Veth'Saral asked.
Chen's expression did not change. Our estimates suggest the main body comprises somewhere between 900 million and 1 billion individual organisms. They are currently 17 hours from this position.
900 million. The number was incomprehensible. Even at the height of the Sirkorath ascendancy, they had never fielded more than a few 100,000 vessels. The very concept of a fleet numbered in billions was beyond anything their civilization had imagined.
Then they are dead, Cressvalor said flatly. Your weapons are impressive, human, but 47 ships cannot hold against 1 billion.
You're correct, Chen agreed. 47 ships would be insufficient. She turned to speak to someone off camera, and Veth'Saral caught a fragment of the conversation.
Confirm transition status. All task forces?
A response too quiet to hear.
Good. Begin Phase 2.
Chen turned back to the display, addressing the assembled representatives of the remnant species.
My 47 ships are the advance element of the Seoul Defense Initiative's Expeditionary Force. We are here to assess the threat and coordinate our response with surviving Allied powers. Her voice remained calm, but there was something new in her tone now, something that Veth'Saral could only describe as wait. The rest of our fleet will begin arriving in approximately 3 hours.
The rest of your fleet, Tael Nis said. How many ships? Chen was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, all of them. 3 hours passed like 3 centuries. Veth'Saral spent them in the command center, watching the tactical displays, reviewing the sensor data from the human engagement, and trying to understand what he had witnessed. The more he analyzed, the less sense it made. The quantum dissolution field was technology so far beyond anything the elder species had developed that it seemed almost supernatural. The Sirkorath had experimented with space-time manipulation for millennia, but their most advanced prototypes could barely create stable microsingularities. What the humans had deployed operated on principles that didn't appear in any physics textbook he knew. And they had done it casually. Chen had described it as Phase 1, an opening move, a preliminary step in a larger strategy. What would Phase 2 look like? Around the 2nd hour, human support vessels began docking at Sanctuary Station. They were utilitarian craft, designed for efficiency rather than aesthetics, but Veth'Saral noticed that each one carried medical supplies, emergency rations, and repair equipment in quantities that suggested the humans had prepared for exactly this scenario. The crews were polite. professional. They moved through the station with the quiet competence of people who had done this work many times before, treating alien casualties with the same care they would give their own species. One of the medical officers, a young man with dark skin and patient eyes, spent 20 minutes explaining Sir Karath physiology to his team until they could treat Tyelnis's plasma burns with confidence. "You've trained for this," Vethsaral observed, watching the medical operations from the observation gallery. Captain Webb, one of the officers who had accompanied Chen, stood beside him. He had said very little since their arrival, content to observe and listen. "We train for everything," Webb said. "It's kind of our thing." "Your thing. Humans, I mean. We prepare. We plan. We run scenarios and simulations and stress tests until we can handle anything that gets thrown at us." He paused, watching a medical team carry a wounded Velthrani toward a treatment station. "We learned a long time ago that the universe doesn't care if you're ready or not. It just happens. So we decided to always be ready." Webb smiled, though there was something in his expression that was not quite humor. 3 centuries in space. Yeah, but we were around a lot longer than that before we left Earth. Couple 100,000 years of making mistakes and learning from them, getting knocked down and getting back up, watching everything we built get torn apart by nature, by disease, by each other, and then building it again anyway. "I am unfamiliar with your early history." "Most species are. We don't talk about it much." Webb was quiet for a moment. "We came close to wiping ourselves out more than once. Wars, plagues, climate catastrophes. There were times when our entire species was down to a few thousand individuals, huddled together in the dark, waiting to see if we'd survive until morning." Vethsaral turned to look at him directly. "Yet you persisted." "We persisted. Every time, no matter how bad it got, no matter how hopeless things seemed, there were always people who refused to give up, who looked at the end of everything and said, 'Not today.' And they were usually right." "What made them right?" Webb met his gaze, and for the first time, Vethsaral saw something ancient behind those young-seeming eyes. Stubbornness, mostly. The absolute refusal to accept that anything is impossible until you've tried everything else. And then you try the impossible anyway, just to be sure. Before Vethsaral could respond, the command center's alarms began to sound. "Fold space emergence detected," a tactical officer announced. "Multiple signatures. We're counting. 100. 200. The numbers kept climbing. Vethsaral turned to the main display, expecting to see the Consuming's main body arriving ahead of schedule. Instead, he saw something that made his heart stop. Ships were emerging from fold space, but not the organic nightmares of the Consuming. These were human vessels, identical in design philosophy to the 47 that had arrived with Chen, emerging in perfect formation across dozens of entry points. 4,000, 5,000, still climbing. They kept coming. Warships, carriers, support vessels, craft of sizes and configurations Vethsaral couldn't identify, all of them bearing the simple insignia of the Sole Defense Initiative, all of them moving with the mechanical precision of a perfectly choreographed dance. 15,000, 20,000. The display struggled to keep up. Icons representing human vessels began to overlap, becoming a solid mass of blue-green indicators that slowly filled the sensor sphere. Cress Valor had come to stand beside him. Her scales were pale, cycling through shades of disbelief that Vethsaral had never seen on a Velthrani admiral. 200,000. 300,000. "This is impossible," she whispered. "They have been spacefaring for 3 centuries. 3 centuries! How can they possibly?" 500,000. 700,000. Sorrel understood, finally, why the humans had been so calm. They had not been desperate. They had not been making a token gesture. They had sent 47 ships ahead because that was all they needed for the advance assessment.
The actual response was something else entirely.
900,000. 1 million. Emergence rate stabilizing. Final count 1,200,000 vessels.
The command center was absolutely silent.
Admiral Chen's voice broke through the quiet, as calm as it had been from the first moment Veth Sorrel had met her.
Remnant Command, this is Admiral Chen. Seoul Defense Initiative Primary Fleet has completed transition. We are assuming operational command of theater defense under the mutual assistance protocols established at Geneva Station 8 years ago.
Geneva Station. Veth Sorrel searched his memory. A minor outpost, a backwater trading post where the humans had hosted a conference on interspecies cooperation. The Seer Korath had sent a junior diplomat. The protocols established there had been considered inconsequential.
Now he realized they had been laying the groundwork for exactly this moment.
All fleet elements are to proceed to their assigned positions per Operation Terminus, Chen continued. Defense formations will be established along the following coordinates. Our allies are welcome to support as they see fit, but I strongly recommend positioning non-human vessels behind our primary defensive line.
She paused, and when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that Veth Sorrel could only call compassion.
You've been fighting alone for too long. Let us handle this. The hours that followed were the strangest of Veth Sorrel's long life.
He watched from Sanctuary Station as the human fleet deployed into positions that seemed almost artistic in their complexity. Each ship knew exactly where it was supposed to be, exactly what it was supposed to do. There was no confusion, no overlapping commands, no jockeying for position. Just quiet efficiency on a scale that dwarfed anything the elder species had ever achieved. And as he watched, he listened. The humans left their communication channels open, either by accident or by design, and through those channels, Veth Sorrel heard fragments of their conversations. Captains confirming readiness, engineers reporting power levels, medical officers coordinating casualty reception protocols. And, most strangely, he heard them talking to each other about ordinary things. Families they missed, books they were reading, jokes and complaints, and small moments of connection that had nothing to do with the battle ahead. They spoke like people who had accepted the possibility of death and decided not to let that possibility prevent them from living.
You seem troubled, Chen said. She had come to the observation gallery at some point, though Veth Sorrel could not have said when. She stood beside him now, looking out at the vast display of human ships with an expression he could not read.
I am trying to understand, he said slowly, how your species accomplished this.
Accomplished what? All of it. The technology, the unity, the sheer numbers. You are a young species, Admiral, the youngest spacefaring civilization in this sector. Yet you have built a fleet that makes the combined might of the elder species look trivial.
Chen was quiet for a moment.
When we first reached the stars, she said, we found something we didn't expect. We found that we were alone. Not alone in the sense that no other species existed. We knew you were out there, even before we made contact. But alone in the sense that no one was coming to help us. No one was going to protect us. No one was going to make sure we survived.
That is the nature of existence, Veth Sorrel said. Every species must secure its own survival.
Yes,
But humans, we internalized that lesson in a way that other species don't seem to. We looked at the galaxy and saw a universe full of dangers, natural disasters, hostile species, extinction-level events that could come from anywhere at any time. And we decided that we were never going to be caught unprepared again.
She turned to look at him, and in her eyes Veth Saral saw something he had mistaken for mere calm. It was certainty. The absolute, unshakable conviction that humanity would survive, not because they believed themselves superior, but because they had chosen survival as their highest purpose and subordinated everything else to that goal.
We didn't build this fleet because we wanted to conquer anyone, Chen said. We built it because we knew, someday, something would come for us. Something we couldn't negotiate with, couldn't appease, couldn't hide from. And when that day came, we were going to be ready. The consuming, or something else. It doesn't matter what shape the threat takes. What matters is that we can face it.
Veth Saral absorbed this in silence. Then, carefully,
The technology you used, the quantum dissolution field, I have never seen anything like it.
You won't, not from any other species. Chen's voice was gentle but firm. There are some things we don't share, High Arbiter, not because we're selfish, but because some knowledge is too dangerous to spread. What we can do, it took us 2 centuries to develop the ethical frameworks to use it responsibly. We won't give it to species that haven't done the same work. And yet you use it for us now. We're not using it for you. We're using it for everyone. The consuming threatens all life in this galaxy. Our response is proportional to that threat.
Proportional, Veth Saral repeated. 1 million ships against 1 billion.
For the first time, Chen's expression shifted to something almost resembling amusement.
High Arbiter, you still don't understand. Those million ships aren't our entire capability. They're just what we deployed for this operation.
Veth Saral felt his carapace shiver. What else do you have?
Enough, Chen said simply. Enough for whatever comes. That's always been the goal.
Before he could respond, the tactical alarms began to sound again. This time, there was no mistaking what the sensors had detected. The consuming had arrived. The main display flickered and stabilized, and Veth Saral saw the face of annihilation.
They came in a wave that stretched across light minutes of space, so vast that the sensors could only approximate their numbers. The count climbed past 100 million, past 500 million, past 800 million. Individual organisms ranged from the size of fighters to the size of small moons, all of them moving with perfect coordination, all of them hungry. At the leading edge of the swarm, Veth Saral spotted forms he had never seen before, massive entities that dwarfed even the largest human vessels, their surfaces covered with what appeared to be weapon emplacements and launch bays. Command organisms, perhaps. Leaders. The consuming was no longer scouting. It had come to feed.
Admiral Chen's voice cut through the tension.
All fleet elements, this is Admiral Chen. The enemy has arrived. We are initiating Operation Terminus. She paused, and Veth Saral heard her take a breath, the first sign of anything other than perfect composure she had shown. Humanity has waited a long time for this moment. 3 centuries of building, preparing, sacrificing. Tonight, we show the galaxy why.
All task forces confirm readiness.
Quantum lock networks synchronized across all sectors. Weapons systems at full power, targeting solutions are live. Phase 2 deployment is complete. Phase 3 standing by.
Veth Sorrel watched the human ships settle into their final positions. Each vessel occupied a specific point in what appeared to be a vast three-dimensional grid, their positions forming patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision.
The consuming closed the distance. 1 light minute, 50 light seconds, 20. And still the humans did not fire.
The Velthrani officers in the command center were growing restless. Even Cress Volor, chastened by what she had witnessed earlier, seemed unable to understand why the humans were waiting.
They're going to be overrun, one of the tactical officers muttered. Why won't they?
Wait, Veth Sorrel said, his voice sharper than he intended. Watch. At 10 light seconds, the consuming began to accelerate. At 5 light seconds, they achieved attack velocity.
At 2 light seconds, Admiral Chen spoke a single word. Now. The universe turned white.
What happened next was not a battle. It was not even a massacre. It was erasure on a scale that defied description. The quantum dissolution field that had destroyed 4 million consuming vessels was nothing compared to what the full human fleet deployed. 1 million ships, each one generating its own field, each field calibrated to overlap with the others in precise geometric patterns. Where the fields intersected, reality itself seemed to unravel. The consuming met the leading edge of the effect at full speed, and they simply stopped existing. Not in clusters or groups, but in waves, hundreds of millions of organisms unmade in the span of seconds. The command entities that Veth Sorrel had spotted tried to adapt, tried to change their forms, but there was nothing to adapt to. The field didn't destroy matter. It convinced the universe that the matter had never existed in the first place.
The entire engagement lasted less than 90 seconds.
When it ended, the tactical display showed a universe emptied of the consuming. Every organism, every fragment, every scattered piece of the swarm that had threatened to end all civilized life in the galaxy.
Gone.
The command center was absolutely silent.
Admiral Chen's voice broke through the quiet, still calm, still professional.
Operation Terminus is complete. All enemy contacts have been neutralized. Casualty assessment pending. A pause. Well done, everyone. Well done.
Veth Sorrel stood in the center of the observation gallery, staring at the display, feeling something he had not felt in decades.
Awe. Pure, unfiltered awe at what he had just witnessed.
Arbiter.
Tail Niss's voice was barely a whisper.
What are they?
He did not answer immediately.
What were they?
They were humans. A species that had seemed so ordinary, so unimpressive, so easy to dismiss. A species that other civilizations had patronized and overlooked for centuries, assuming that their youth meant weakness. But they had never been weak.
They had been waiting, preparing,
Building something that no one else could see, because no one else thought to look.
and now that building was complete.
They are survivors, Veth Sorrel said finally. They are survivors who decided to make sure nothing would ever threaten their survival again.
The hours after Operation Terminus were strange and quiet.
Human ships moved through the void, collecting debris, scanning for survivors, ensuring that nothing of the consuming remained. Their efficiency was almost unsettling in its thoroughness. They left nothing to chance.
Veth Sorrel found himself on a human vessel, having accepted an invitation from Admiral Chen to observe the cleanup operations. The ship was called the Perseverance, and it moved through space with the same quiet competence that characterized everything the humans did.
The interior was functional,
comfortable but not luxurious. The crew treated Veth Soral with polite respect, answering his questions without condescension, sharing information without boasting. They seemed genuinely pleased that the elder species had survived.
"You saved us," Veth Soral said to Chen as they stood on the command deck, watching the stars through the forward viewports. "You could have let us die. You could have waited until the consuming finished with the elder species and then engaged them on your own terms. Why didn't you?"
Chen was quiet for a long moment.
"Because that's not who we are," she said finally. "We've done terrible things in our history, High Arbiter. We've let fear and hatred drive us to acts that still shame us, even now. But we've also learned something important along the way."
"What is that?"
"That strength without compassion is just cruelty. That power without responsibility is just tyranny." She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw something that might have been hope. "We built all of this because we wanted to survive. But survival alone isn't enough. We want to be worthy of survival."
And saving us makes you worthy?
Saving you makes us who we choose to be. It makes us the species we want to become. She smiled, and it was a tired smile, a smile of someone who had carried a heavy burden for a very long time. Besides, the galaxy is more interesting with all of you in it. It would be a shame to lose the Sirkorath just because we were too selfish to help.
Veth Soral felt something shift in his chest, something old and hard and tired, something that had been building for centuries began to crack.
"I owe you an apology," he said. Chen raised an eyebrow.
For 300 years, my species looked at yours and saw nothing worth fearing. We assumed you were temporary, insignificant. We dismissed your warnings about the consuming because we could not believe that a species as young as yours could perceive threats that we had missed.
"I know."
And yet you came anyway. Despite everything, you came.
Chen reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that would have been inappropriate between Sirkorath, but seemed natural coming from her.
"High Arbiter, every species makes mistakes. Every civilization has blind spots. What matters isn't the errors you've made. It's what you do when you realize you've made them." She withdrew her hand. "You're still here. Your people are still alive. That means you still have time to do better."
"And if we choose not to?"
"Then we'll be disappointed. But we'll still try to help, because that's what we do." She paused. "We've learned that lesson the hard way. You can't force someone to grow. You can only offer them the chance and hope they take it."
Veth Soral stood in silence for a long moment, processing everything that had happened.
The Sirkorath ascendancy was in ruins. 14 billion of his people were dead. The civilization that had guided the galaxy for 17,000 years had been brought to its knees by an enemy they had thought vanquished.
And they had been saved by a species they had dismissed as insignificant.
There was a lesson in that. A painful, humbling lesson that he suspected would take generations for his people to fully absorb.
"Admiral Chen," he said finally, "when the humans first reached the stars, what did you expect to find?"
Hope, she said without hesitation. We hoped we'd find friends, allies, other species who had faced the darkness and survived, the same way we had. A pause. We found that, eventually. But first, we found a galaxy that looked at us and saw nothing worth respecting. It took a long time for the elder species to see us as anything other than primitives.
"And yet you didn't resent us."
We understood. We'd made the same mistake ourselves a long time ago. It's easy to look at something smaller and younger and assume it has nothing to teach you. She smiled again, and this time there was warmth in it. But the truth is, everyone has something to teach you. You just have to be willing to learn.
Vethsorel nodded slowly. Then perhaps, he said, it is time for the Sir-Karath to start learning.
In the days that followed, the galaxy began to change. The consuming was gone, truly gone, eradicated with a thoroughness that ensured they would never return. Human science teams worked alongside the elder species to understand how the threat had reemerged after 9,000 years, to make sure that whatever had allowed it to survive would not allow it to do so again. The Velthrani, humbled by what they had witnessed, began the slow process of rebuilding their fleets, but this time they did so in consultation with human engineers, integrating technologies they had never imagined possible into designs that had remained unchanged for millennia. The Chrysanthemum Collective, their crystalline consciousness still reeling from the losses they had suffered, found unexpected allies in the human networks. The two species discovered that they had more in common than anyone had realized. Both had learned to think in terms of collective action, of individual sacrifice for the greater good. And the Sir-Karath ascendancy began the long process of examining its own history. For 17,000 years, they had been the eldest, the wisest, the natural leaders of galactic civilization. That certainty had blinded them to threats they should have seen coming, had made them complacent when they should have been vigilant. Now they were learning what humans had learned long ago, that survival was not guaranteed, that the universe was vast and indifferent, that the only real security came from preparation, adaptation, and the willingness to work together. Vethsorel spent much of his remaining years as a diplomat, working to strengthen the bonds between humanity and the elder species. He became a voice for change within the ascendancy, arguing that their ancient pride had become a liability rather than an asset.
Not everyone listened. Some of his people could not accept that their civilization had been saved by beings they had once dismissed. They clung to old certainties, insisting that the humans had merely been lucky, that their technology was a fluke that would not last.
But the numbers could not be denied. 1 million ships had done what billions of consuming organisms could not prevent. 47 advanced scouts had destroyed more of the enemy than the entire combined fleet of the elder species. A species barely 3 centuries old had developed weapons that made the most advanced technology of the elder races look primitive by comparison. The humans were not what anyone had expected. And perhaps, Vethsorel reflected, that was the most important lesson of all. The final time Vethsorel saw Admiral Chen was at a ceremony marking the first anniversary of Operation Terminus. She looked older than he remembered. Humans aged so quickly, their lives compressed into such brief spans. But her eyes still held the same quiet certainty they always had. "I've been thinking about our first conversation," he said, "when you arrived at Sanctuary Station with 47 ships, and we all assumed you were making a token gesture." Chen smiled. "I remember the Velthrani admiral was particularly unimpressed." She laughed. They all laughed, though most were polite enough to do it quietly. A tiny fleet, they called it, an insult wrapped in the pretense of assistance. "And now?" "And now the galaxy understands why you sent so few, because so few were all you needed." Vethsorel paused. "You could have sent the full fleet from the beginning. You could have shown your strength and demanded respect. Why didn't you?" Chen considered the question for a moment. "Because respect that comes from fear is worthless," she said. "We wanted you to see who we really are, Not conquerors, not tyrants, just people who are very, very good at surviving and who believe that everyone else deserves the chance to survive too.
Even those who dismissed you?
Especially those who dismissed us, because if we only helped the people who respected us, we'd be no better than the bullies we've always hated. She reached out and clasped his shoulder, a gesture he had come to understand as one of deep friendship. High Arbiter, the consuming is gone. The immediate threat is over. But the universe is still full of dangers, and there will be other crises ahead.
When those times come, I hope the elder species will remember that strength is not measured in pride or age or the weight of your history. It's measured in what you're willing to do for each other.
Veth Sorrel felt the weight of her words settle into his consciousness.
And if we forget? He asked.
Then we'll remind you. That's what allies do.
She smiled once more, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of diplomats and officials who had gathered to celebrate humanity's victory.
Veth Sorrel watched her go, thinking about everything that had changed since that first moment when 47 human ships had emerged from fold space and the galaxy had laughed.
They had laughed at the tiny fleet. And then everything had died. Not the galaxy, not the elder species, not the countless billions who had huddled in fear as the consuming advanced. Only the threat itself. Only the ancient horror that had seemed unstoppable. Only the darkness that had promised to consume all light. That was what the humans understood, what they had always understood. You don't survive by being the biggest or the oldest or the most feared. You survive by being the one who refuses to stop, the one who prepares when others are complacent, the one who reaches out a hand when others would turn away. The humans had laughed at death for 200,000 years, and in the end, death had blinked first.
Veth Sorrel turned to look at the stars, feeling older than he ever had before, but also, for the first time in years, feeling hope.
The galaxy had been saved by a species that had once been beneath notice.
And perhaps that was exactly what the galaxy had needed.
A reminder that strength comes from unexpected places, that compassion is not weakness, that the smallest flame, properly tended, can hold back the endless dark. The humans would go on building, preparing, waiting for the next crisis, whenever it might come. And when it did, they would face it the same way they had faced everything else. Together. Stubborn. Unstoppable.
Not because they were special, but because they refused to be anything else.
And in the end, that was enough. It was always enough.